Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully, you've gotten a good groove going for the class now. Last week, we discussed the origins of the Constitution. This week, we're going to discuss the concept of federalism. As always, I hope you are viewing this after reading the material and are focused and taking notes. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. All right, let's start the journey through federalism. All right, so what are we going to learn this week? Well, I hope that you'll be able to answer these 5 questions. So, question number 1: what is federalism and why should I care? Number 2: how has federalism evolved in the United States? 3: be able to identify and compare the different conceptions of federalism. Number 4: identify and explain the different types of federal intergovernmental grants and mandates. So before we begin, I want you to take a look at this picture. What does it represent? Take a minute and think. Well, these are postcard images of different states. So what does this have to do with federalism? Hopefully, you know that there are 50 states that make up the United States. Each of those states have political institutions and their own systems of government. However, the concept of federalism is really turning the I into we, as we will see throughout the lecture. Let's see how we can define federalism in the next step. Federalism is a form of government in which different levels of government act relatively autonomously and have the power to act directly on people within their jurisdiction. Typically, federalism involves a centralized federal government and any number of regional or subnationalized governments. So think of it as federalism typically has a federal government, and then in the United States, each of our states have governments. So those are your regional governments. So there are some structural characteristics of federalism that you should be aware of. They're listed on the screen here. I'm not going to go into great detail on those as you can read. However, I do want to point out that some of the structural characteristics involve allocating legislative, judicial, and executive authority and the levels somewhat interacting. These are important and these are seen on a daily basis between federal and state governments. Each state has legislative, judicial, and executive authority within their state, as well as the federal legislative, judicial, and executive branches of government. And remember, last week we discussed separation of power and those reserved powers for the states. But also remember that whenever laws come into play that contradict each other at the federal and state level, the supremacy clause is implemented, which means that federal laws outweigh states when in conflict. So there are different systems of government that your text goes over, and this figure does a really good job of kind of encapsulating that into one place. So the first type is a unitary system. And in the unitary system, authority is concentrated in the central government, so the national government. And then powers are delegated to the states from the national government. Some examples of this include the United Kingdom, Japan, and Sweden. Then we have a confederation. So the word confederation should sound familiar to you from our discussion last week. Remember the Articles of Confederation. And in the Articles of Confederation, the states had the majority of the power. So the confederation system of government is where the states hold most of the authority. And the national government is only given powers that is divested from the states to the national government. However, the third type is a federation. And in a federation, authority is divided between a central and state government and is derived from the people. And so, really, the United States under our current Constitution is considered a federation. All right, so let's look at federal and state power. If you'll also remember back to our conversation last week, there were two types of powers that we discussed. We discussed the enumerated powers, which is right here, and the reserved powers, which is right here. So remember, enumerated powers are those powers that are explicitly stated in the Constitution. So those are powers of the federal government that the Constitution gives the federal government. So you can, the federal government can make money, regulate interstate and foreign commerce, establish copyright, regulate postal systems, establish courts, can declare war, things like that. And remember, reserved powers are powers not expressly given to the national government, however, were intended to be exercised by the states. So this is, they are able to regulate intrastate commerce, which means state to state. They can conduct elections, provide for public health, establish local governments, and ratify amendments in their constitution. And I think I misspoke. Intrastate means commerce within the state, not state to state. I apologize for that. So you also have shared powers, which are also known as concurrent powers. So with concurrent powers means that both the federal and state government share those powers. So both the federal and state government can levy and collect taxes. They can establish courts. They can take property, known as eminent domain. So constitutional powers and responsibilities are divided between the U.S. federal and state government. The two levels of government also share those concurrent powers. So again, the enumerated powers are those that are expressly stated, and under the enumerated powers, it's also necessary for us to talk about a special clause in the Constitution. So Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 states that Congress also has the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States. So this right here is what that clause states. This clause is known as the elastic clause, or what I want you to remember, the necessary and proper clause. This clause grants Congress extensive authority to act in the furtherance of its enumerated powers. Courts have taken a particularly broad view of federal government to act under the Commerce Clause, which grants the power to regulate interstate commerce. The U.S. Constitution does not enumerate the powers to state government. The framers of the Constitution believed that states possessed reserved powers, that is, all powers not prohibited to the states by the Constitution or delegated to the national government. The 10th Amendment enshrines reserved powers to the states. 10th Amendment enshrines those reserved powers to the states. Article 1, Section 10 restricts the power of states to act within certain areas, including they can't enter into treaties with foreign governments, they can't coin their own money, they can't levy taxes on imports or exports, or suspend or writ of habeas corpus, passing bills of attainder, or passing ex post facto laws. So basically, the Constitution states states cannot do this. So they can't. So Georgia can't go into China and make a treaty with China for importing and exporting goods. That has to be done through the federal government. Several constitutional amendments also include important restraints on state powers. The 14th Amendment prohibits states from denying individual rights granted to them under the Constitution. The 15th, 19th, and 26th Amendments also include important protections of individual civil rights, including the prohibition on state governments from abridging the right of citizens to vote based on race, sex, or age. So you can see through the amendment process that the federal government can restrict state powers. The Supremacy Clause, it really kind of comes back to this. We've already talked about this once. But remember, the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution states that federal laws and treaties are the supreme law of the land. And under this clause, federal law and treaties prevail over conflicting state law as long as the federal government was acting within its constitutional authority. So there's some information that you should know around distribution of financing. Federal, state, and local governments rely primarily on their taxation powers to raise revenue to fund their expenditures. So we talked a little bit about revenue and expenditures during our first week's lessons. It's good for you to know that taxation is really how states and federal government raise revenue. The 16th Amendment authorizes Congress to tax the income of individuals without appropriating it to the states on the basis of population. And the federal government raises about half of its revenues from individual income taxes and about 1/3 of its revenue from payroll taxes. So if you work and you get a check, you're going to see state income taxes taken out and federal income taxes taken out. Those are revenue, sources of revenue for both the state and the federal government. Those are part of those concurrent powers that both the state and federal government hold together. All right, so we've talked a little bit about federalism. So now let's look at federalism's evolution, because federalism has evolved over the years. The history of federalism really goes back to the debate around whether the centralized federal government can have a centralized bank. So Alexander Hamilton, who was the Treasury Secretary, and Thomas Jefferson, who was the Secretary of State, had a battle over having a national centralized bank. Jefferson did not support stating that there was no constitutional grounds for a centralized bank. However, Hamilton won the argument, and a national bank was legislated into existence. As we know, when Jefferson became president, he did not renew that charter. So when he became president, he stuck to his guns about not having a nationalized bank. In the early 1800s, several decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court greatly expanded the powers of the national government through the court's expansive interpretation of the Necessary and Proper Clause. particularly as it applied to the power of Congress to regulate interstate commerce. During the same period, states sought to curb the growing power of the national government by asserting states had a power to nullify national laws that states viewed as unconstitutional. This really all came to a head with a Supreme Court case, McAuliffe v. Maryland. And although we haven't talked about the Supreme Court, and we're not going to talk about it until Module 3, it is important for you to note that the Supreme Court, as it was created, was meant to interpret laws and create what's called precedent, which set forth our foundational principles of understanding what the Constitution means. The Supreme Court justices are tasked with interpreting the Constitution. All right? So in 1816, McAuliffe v. Maryland, the U.S. Supreme Court addressed the issue of federal power and commerce. A little background: Mr. McAuliffe refused to pay income tax imposed on all out-of-state chartered banks. The Supreme Court ruled that Congress had the authority to charter under the Necessary and Proper Clause, which, going back to the debate between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, basically Congress is saying under the Necessary and Proper Clause, Congress had the authority to create a national bank. And in this instance, Congress had the authority to impose taxes on chartered banks. So during the 1860s, there was a theory that went around known as the nullification theory. Nullification says states have the right to reject laws they deem unconstitutional. The debate went back and forth from the late 1820s through the Civil War, when the Union victory ended states' rights to secede. Post-Civil War balance of power tilted toward the federal government. Thus, nullification was minimized. Following that period and following the end of Reconstruction in 1877, the United States entered a period of marked dual federalism. So, dual federalism refers to a political arrangement in which the national government and state governments act in distinct areas of jurisdiction, which basically means they act in different spheres or silos. They don't intermingle. The federal government has its powers, the state government has its powers, and they don't come together, and they don't work together very well. So the 1930s changed all of that. What do you think happened in the 1930s that changed the power dynamic between the state and federal government? The Great Depression. The 1930s came to be to usher in a new era of federalism known as cooperative federalism, in which states and national governments worked together to solve problems. During the Great Depression, the United States entered a period of cooperative federalism when the states and national governments had to coordinate efforts to address the problems that arose through the Great Depression. During this period, the federal government expanded its powers in several ways, including economic regulation and civil rights protections. So it's important to note with cooperative federalism that the Great Depression changed life as we knew it in terms of federalism. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal was needed to help the nation that was fraught with economic hardship. This also began a time where states and federal governments worked together to solve the problems. And because of the economic hardship, that's where we're seeing the federal government expand that power into economic regulation and protections and social welfare programs to help people and all of that. So you kind of see during cooperative federalism, states and federal government working together, but you also see the federal government kind of expanding the scope of their power. Franklin D. Roosevelt, or FDR, he had a legislative agenda called the New Deal. And FDR's New Deal was needed to help the nation that was really bad in terms of its economics. This also began a time where states and federal governments worked together to solve problems. So we go from the 1930s kind of working together, and we have about a 40-year time frame until a new form of federalism comes into play. In the 1970s, new federalism started to emerge. And when we talk about new federalism, we're talking about the decentralization of governmental operations. So remember, during cooperative federalism, the federal government was gaining power. So now, in the 1970s, and particularly with Richard Nixon's presidency, we see an attempt to restore state power in certain areas. So in the early 1980s, Ronald Reagan continued that. It continued the implementation of new federalism by decentralizing national power. So when we talk about decentralization, we're talking about giving it back to the states. So where power was centralized with the federal government, if we're saying it's decentralized, we're saying that President Nixon and President Reagan gave those powers back to the states. And they saw an increasing revenue sharing with state and local governments, and states and local governments had greater discretion with spending, with grants and things like that. You start to see that the Republican platform here really is about the decentralization of governmental power, of federal governmental power. All right, here you have a really cool visual model of the history of federalism. And whoever did this was hungry, and it makes me hungry looking at it, but it's a really easy way to remember the dynamics of federalism. So the layer cake model is a model utilized by some in the political science arena to describe the evolution of power under federalism. As you see, the past, right here, past, is the layer cake model of federalism. So in the layer cake model, think of it as a layer cake. So you have different layers that make up the entire overall cake, but those layers are clearly defined. So here you have some chocolate in the layer, and some vanilla, and then some more chocolate and vanilla, chocolate and vanilla. And hardly do those layers ever intermingle. However, as we have seen over our discussion, federalism evolved, and it's best represented now in a marble cake model, which is marble cake federalism. And as you can see, programs and authorities are mixed among national, state, and local government, so just like a marble cake. So when you cut into a marble cake, you see all of this mixed together. So we've come from an era where you were siloed with dual federalism into cooperative federalism and new federalism, where you still see some intermingling, but there's some powers going back to state, but the federal government still intermingles. So you kind of have a mixture of power here. So why does all of this matter? Well, it matters to understand the relationship between the state and federal government, because states rely on federal government funding and assistance, and the federal government can compel state governments to act in national interest by offering financial incentives. So we all know that money talks, and the federal government really kind of manipulates their power utilizing intergovernmental grants and unfunded mandates. So we go back to those concurrent powers of taxation. Taxation is one form of revenue for states and federal governments. More so for states, they also rely on grants to help fund some of their revenue streams in the states. So states rely on the federal government, and it's important for us to understand what these grants and mandates truly are. So let's start with taking a look at grants. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the federal government often used land grants to promote state actions in certain areas. Many state universities exist because of federal land grant programs that promoted higher education. Since the late 19th century, the federal government has primarily used cash grants to promote state and local governments to undertake certain actions. There are two types of cash grants that the federal government offers the states. The first type is known as a categorical grant, and I'm right here. So categorical grants typically contain restrictions on the recipient's discretion to use the funds. So if you get a categorical grant, let's say the state needs a grant to build 4 bridges, and they ask the federal government for an infrastructure grant targeted to building and upkeeping those bridges. If they get a categorical grant, that will come with strings attached. And those strings attached will be the federal government saying, you have to use the money for this certain area. So you have to use the money that we're going to give you in that scenario. We're going to give you money for the infrastructure grant, but you have to use it to fund the upkeep of these certain bridges. All right. The other type of grant are block grants. And block grants allow for greater discretion of the recipient because they come with fewer conditions and less administrative oversight. Now, it is important to know that the vast majority of federal grants are categorical grants. So the vast majority of grants come with restrictions on discretion. Figure 3.13 I put in the PowerPoint because it's a really good visual representation for you to see how much we relied on grants. The thermometer shows federal grants to the state and local governments have steadily increased since the 1960s. The pie chart shows how federal grants are allocated among different functional categories. So you see most of the grants are to do with health. Then you have income security and things like that. All right. So remember, um, the second way that the federal government can limit states um, is through what's known as unfunded mandates. Unfunded mandates are federal laws or regulations that require state or local government to undertake certain obligations without the federal government providing any compensation. The federal government uses unfunded mandates to compel state or local action on education, environmental protection, homeland security, civil rights, that type of thing. It's important to note that unfunded mandates are highly controversial because it's basically the federal government's telling the states, you have to do this or you have to fund this, like you have to fund more homeland security, but we're not going to give you any money to do that. So you have to do it because we are telling you you have to do it, but we're not going to provide any financial incentive for that. So what are some of the benefits of federalism? Well, federalism itself encourages innovative approaches to social and economic policy. It allows citizens of one state to maybe pursue a certain policy which might work for them. And if that works, it allows the federal government to say, hey, if that worked here, maybe this will work over here. They create kind of policy laboratories. States have led the way in numerous issues, including granting women's right to vote, promoting environmental protection, and improving health insurance through federalism. However, there are some drawbacks to federalism. Federalism also comes with certain drawbacks. So disparities in education, environmental protection, and healthcare are just some of the more concerning, I would say. Um, Federalist systems may have multiple levels of bureaucracy, which could create inefficiencies or conflict. And basically, what that means is um, in order to get things done, you might have to go through multiple levels and multiple layers to get approval and things like that. All right, this lecture is not as long as the last couple. We are wrapping up the week 3 lecture. Here are a couple of um, items I hope that you've taken away from this with the reading and such. Federalism is the institutional arrangement that creates two relatively autonomous levels of government. The power struggle between state and federal governments has varied throughout history and is best categorized through the layer cake and marble cake models. Grants and unfunded mandates are ways the federal government exercise power over states. And federalism has its perks, such as freedom for states to create policy laboratories, but it also has some drawbacks, such as economic disparities. All right, that is week 3. I hope you all have a fantastic week. I look forward to seeing your interaction in our discussion forum, and good luck on your week 3 quiz. As always, if you need anything, feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.